I've been with Loma for almost 5 years now. Um, I'm from Ukraine originally, so if you try to guess my accent, I'm Ukrainian. So I moved to the US when I was like 23, probably. That's when was the time when I went to Andrews. So I got my MDiv at Andrews. Um, After my MDiv, I ended up working at Emory Hospital where I was doing chaplaincy training. And that was a very interesting experience because Emory Hospital is probably one of the most intense hospitals in southern region. So basically, all the hospitals ship their patients with nothing that works in their hospitals. They, send it to Emory as the last resort. So we had a lot of very sick, very complicated cases. So during my training there, I got to see a lot of interesting and difficult cases and be with people there. I worked on a palliative care team there, and I worked also on a organ transplant team. And those two, like my supervisor at the time was also head of the ethics committee. Um, and I got very interested in ethics and bioethics, medical ethics, um, because of interesting cases I've seen. So, like one of the cases I saw there, like I can briefly mention, um, there was a patient who was operated at Emory, and that patient had a very rare disease, a virus that was not killed through sterilization. So if you operate on the patient, instruments sterilized, but virus was still on. We didn't know about that. We found out that 2 years later, while we're using those instruments, so potentially exposed some people to the virus, but it was not our fault. So we were trying to decide what to do, how to tell people, how to inform them, not to scare them, but at the same time to help them. And so that was part of the ethics discussions, I was part of, or like part of discussions about organ allocations, who needs, since it's such a limited resource, who can get organs and why, how do we decide? So that's what bioethics studies, and that's what got me interested in medical ethics or bioethics. And I ended up doing my PhD in bioethics in Pittsburgh. After Pittsburgh, I also had opportunity to teach and do my postdoctoral studies at Yale University, focusing on public health and focusing on HIV prevention. And after that, I ended up at Loma University working in several areas doing research. So I started in School of Religion, but then kind of got invited by School of Behavioral Health to join because some of my research actually fits very, very well with what they do. So I think that's in a nutshell. Oh,
Thank you. I didn't know some of those exciting facts. Thank you again, Alex. So before we begin, let's bow our heads for a prayer, if you okay. Dear God, our gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you claiming your promise that you will continue to guide us, continue to protect us from any harm or danger. And we thank you so much for loving us and providing your unfailing love to us every day. We want to take this opportunity to learn a little bit more about how to take care of ourselves and taking care of our loved ones and our friends and community. May you continue to bless us, bless Alex as he could share his expertise with us. May we all learn something so that we can use and glorify your name. Thank you for being with us here. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So it's all yours, Alex. And I would like people, if you have any questions for Alex, please through chat, write to me privately, and I will ask those questions at the end. Is that okay, Alex?
Yeah, or you can actually even stop me. It's also fine as well.
Okay.
If you raise your hands, maybe I can see
Okay.
you. So I I don't mind.
All right.
So let me probably give some introduction or about my interest in suicide prevention and how I got to know this topic. While working at Yale, I worked closely with one of the researchers. She became my mentor and almost I call her my Jewish mother. She she almost adopted me and helped me start my research, and also became very close friends. And I learned about her daughter who went through she's transgendered and went through a difficult time, and that family had to go through a lot of issues also trying to understand all that. But that I'll mention in my research that group particularly very susceptible to suicide. So the suicide among that group of people is 10 times higher than in general population. So my mentor and I started to think, what can we do? So she was next to her daughter experiencing, suicidal thoughts, and we started to think, what can we do to prevent suicides, or is there anything we can do as researchers to understand better suicide? So we decided to develop an app. I'm applying for a grant, and I just submitted articles about it. And so this app, the idea behind this app, it's almost like a tracker of moods of people. So people use this app to track their moods, their emotions, their feelings, and it gives us. And they also track their events, throughout the day. So it's like this app it gives people ability to see how their moods goes up and down, and what causes it, some triggers, because sometimes you come to mental health professionals. A lot of those people actually in counseling, and they come to mental health professionals and they say, well, I had a very bad week. But when you ask them to unpack, they don't really know. They just know that the week was bad. But this app gives a little bit more of a fine grain kind of understanding of what actually went bad. So for example, on Tuesday, I had a conflict with my colleague, and my mood went down. On Thursday, I had a phone call with my parents, and it helped me to feel better, right? So this app gives you like a way to track your moods and events throughout the week, and helps, when you go to mental health professional, to kind of review together with the mental health professional events and moods throughout the week. But it also gives us a way to observe people in real time and try to understand how the progression towards suicide. So how their moods get worse and worse and worse. And we hope, we only in the beginning of this work, but we hope that we can intervene a little bit earlier. So we'll use very complex algorithms trying to predict. So basically, if somebody has this entry or this event in their life, or this something like this happens, then next one will be even worse, next one will be even worse, and maybe we'll be able to intervene a little bit earlier in this sequence and kind of stop this sequence rather than wait until they get to the bottom of it. And that's the issue with suicide. There is still a lot we don't know. A lot of material available about suicide looks at in the past, um, uh, trying to understand how people become suicidal, through the past, not looking forward. Um, and so by kind of observing people how they progress, maybe like it gives us better understanding. So that's my interest in suicide research. And so I can share what I learned through working on this research and this project. And I think, talking about suicide or suicidality, first, it's important to talk about mental health system in the United States, and the reason why suicidality spikes and increases in the United States versus other countries. I'll mention it later in my presentation, that uh, in the last 15 years, there was a 30% increase in suicidality in the United States. But it's not true for other countries. So in Europe, for example, in the same period, there was 20% decrease among 12 countries, Western European countries. So while suicide and suicidality is growing in the United States, it's decreasing elsewhere. And there are many reasons, and we can talk about these reasons later on in my presentation. But one of the reasons for this increase is our mental health system, or disparities in mental health access. And I wanted to start the conversation about suicide by talking about mental health system in the United States, and difficulties that we have in the United States, having people diagnosed, getting them help. Um, there are some historical changes in the United States that led us to, they were very well intended, in the 70s and 80s. There was a change in where we were trying to get people from mental health institutions to integrate into the communities, which was actually a really great idea, right? Because if you probably knew or heard about mental health institutions back then, they were not necessarily the nicest places. So the idea was, well, let's try to get people into the community, help them integrate, which was actually really, really noble and great idea. But implementation of it was not necessarily executed that well. We didn't have enough health providers, mental health centers, some of the mental health treatments within the community, the specific centers where people should have access to get their help. They were not necessarily well funded. So people started to not receiving the help they need. And that's one of the reasons why we have so much of this issue in the United States. So I wanted to start briefly talking about that, and then I'll talk about mental health system in the United States and difficulties accessing it. Then I want to talk about general statistics, about suicide, who is most susceptible to suicide. Some groups within the population, they experiencing more of this issue than others. I wanted to talk about some very well-known myth about suicides, some misconceptions that people usually have. So making sure that we don't have those misconceptions. I want to talk about risk factors. What are some of the risk factors for suicidality? Warning signs, how to spot the warning signs. Then some of the things that we, for example, we spotted the warning signs, like we see somebody's potentially in a dangerous area where they can be suicidal, right? What are the things we shouldn't say to these people? What should some of the things that we should avoid telling? Because we often try to be well-meaning, but we're not necessarily well-equipped to work with these people. So some of the things we should avoid telling, and why. And then some of the things that can actually be helpful. How can we intervene and help somebody with the suicide? And the reason why I wanted to also to start with highlighting the disparities in access to mental health, one reason is to show that it's actually a problem leading to suicide in the United States, contributing to high rates of suicidality. But I also understand that, speaking to a church, we have a gap in society where church can actually step in and be that place of community, of help. So the reason why I wanted to highlight the gap is not necessarily to say that something is bad within the United States, but to highlight the opportunity for the church to be that place, community place that actually can, because sometimes for people who have mental health issues, belonging to a community and having people to talk to, simply just to talk to, be heard, be listened to, that's probably one of the best interventions they can receive. It's always working with them, but when it's not available or possible, having somebody just sitting with you, listening to you, showing that you actually matter, and your worries and your fears, your struggles actually also matter, and maybe praying with them, and showing that they belong to community, that they part of the community. It's opportunity for the church to step into this gap. So that's one of the reasons I'm also highlighting the disparities, to tell you that there is opportunity for the church to fill in the gap where, because of the way we have mental health systems set up in the United States and having these gaps, that's where church comes in as it has the opportunity to provide those services, provide some of the help. Actually, and I know some of my colleagues in mental health, not even in institutions that are, like Loma Linda is a Christian institution, but even some research centers, they turn into churches asking their help and trying to train people within the church to provide first mental health kind of very basic help to people, knowing that potentially within the church there will be people who struggle, people who need help. So how to spot the signs of struggle, how to help them, how to listen to them. There are so many opportunities for the church to fill in the gap where mental professionals just don't have a capacity to fill in. So let me share my screen, just a second. Um, just a second. Share screen. Okay, so I hope you can see now my screen. Yeah, oh, perfect. So I'll start with the video. I hope you can hear it as well. Hmm. Uh, just a second. I'm sorry. I don't know why it's not working. My apologies. Um, yeah, I guess video. I mean, let me try. I'm sorry. Let me try again. Nope. Um, okay, so let me just go through through the presentation. So as I mentioned briefly, what happened in the United States, there is a lot of disparity in access to mental health treatment. And it's the reason of several acts previously enacted by Parliament and by the government, which had good intent to bring people into the community from psychiatric hospitals into community centers. What happened, unfortunately, these centers historically from 80s to now became underfunded, and because somehow the only time, if you notice in public discourse, if I ask you when we talk about mental health issues, that's the only time we talk about it. It's when there is a public shooting, right? There is no other time we actually as a community talk about mental health issues, which actually not necessarily true, because a lot of people who experience mental health issues are not violent, they don't shoot people. But it's this is the kind of topic that not necessarily generates a lot of promotions and fundings and good for politicians, for political causes. So mental health became historically underfunded in the US. So if you look at this slide, you can see how much need we have. So one of these figures represents 1,000 people, right? So we have this huge need, and only 100,000 beds within the US are available at any given time, but we have so many more people that need them. So what happens to those people with mental health issues that need a bed, need a place to be treated, but they don't get treated? Usually one or three things happen. They end up in jail, in prison, sometimes for petty crimes that they commit, I don't know, some public misdemeanor, something small. And unfortunately, prisons now become the largest mental health providers in the United States. A lot of people become homeless because they're not able to take care of themselves. So they end up on the streets. And suicide also takes a lot of lives because people cannot access mental health treatment or help. Um, so you see that more than half a million people in the United States falling through the cracks of the system. They have nowhere to go, little sympathy from people, and end up either in jails, in morgue, or in on the streets. So, and that's what I mentioned. It became the reason why it happens because. Of consistent cuts from mental health services. So you can see we cut public psychiatric hospital beds, for 4,500 public psychiatric beds, or 10% of total supplies. We cut funding from these systems. And historically, from 1995 to now, about 30% of beds became unavailable or cut. And that contributes to disparity we have now. And about 40% of people with severe mental health illness receive no treatment in the previous year. So if you look at the whole population of people who need treatment, especially severely ill people, 40% of them, they don't get treated. They don't get treatment. And if you look among all mental health illness, including depression, mood disorders, 60% of people don't get treated. So there is a severe lack of access. Um, One of the places also people end up to in the hospitals, they end up in emergency room services. If you ever work in a hospital, you probably know we've seen a lot of people with mental health issues that end up there, and it's very, very difficult for emergency room people to actually take care of people with mental health illness because somebody needs to sit with them all the time. They also usually get admitted, but because again, because there is no places to go, sometimes they need to be transported somewhere else because you need special mental health beds, equipped for people with mental health issues. So mental health emergency rooms get crowded. Also, prisons. I mentioned that about 40% of people with mental health issues get arrested at some point, even though they're usually harmless. It's usually for public disturbance, caused by illness rather than by bad intent. If you look about at the population of all people with mental health issues in the prisons, about 15% of all state prisoners and 24% of jail inmates are psychotic. And but if you look at any mental health issues, about 64% of people in jails actually have mental health issues. So, and jails, as I mentioned, became one of the largest treatment providers in the United States for people with mental health issues. But it's very, very expensive to um, keep somebody in prison just to treat them, because the cost to keep somebody in prison for 1 year is $60,000. It's much cheaper to have them treated. Um, so um, so we have a lot of people in prisons and jails with mental health issues, and about 40% of all calls to the police also come from people with mental health issues. So sometimes police actually become also by de facto providers of mental health treatments, because sometimes, if you look at work in a small city or town, police actually know, oh, this is the call from that person, they probably just need some help, so they become providers of mental health. Um, so prisons, they're not really equipped to provide mental health really to people. For example, if people have self-mutilating tendencies, there is this stories, from Cookjail County in Chicago, where there is, for example, a person who has self-mutilating issues and needed to be fitted with hockey mask because in hockey gloves, so to stop, from mutilating themselves. Uh, but that's prison's really not the best place for those kind of people, to provide help. And talking about homelessness, we also have a lot of people on the streets who are actually experiencing mental health issues and need help with mental health. Um, So about 200,000 people in the United States with any mental health issues are homeless, and so on the streets. Um, and here's the story how this disparity in treatment manifests. It's a story of a lady who suffered from mental illness for 20 years before actually getting help. She had panic attacks, drinking and drug use problems, abusive relationships, 3 suicide attempts, and a felony conviction. When she had first suicide attempt about 30 years before getting diagnosed, when she was still a teenager, parents told her to stop feeling sorry for yourself and snap out of it. Um, and so that's was the kind of first warning signs, and doctors failed to diagnose this. Her name was Love. Mental illness even after suicide attempt, and the only place where actually she was able to get diagnosed and get help and get treatment for her bipolar disorder was in a jail when she was incarcerated after stabbing an abusive boyfriend. Psychiatrist in a jail actually diagnosed her, get her help, medical help, and she helped her to feel much better. But how different the life trajectory of this person would be if she would get diagnosed and treated 30 years before, right? You know, when she would be treated and get help early on. But it's unfortunately a story of many people with mental health issues. They don't get diagnosed early, they don't get help early. On average, it takes about a decade for people with mental health illness to actually get diagnosed and get help. And this, if you remember the statistic I mentioned early on, about 60% of people with mental health issues, with any mental health issues, they didn't get treatment the year before. So they not in treatment. They don't get help that they need. So so that's the place I think, as I mentioned, where given the disparity that we have, disparity, lack of these centers and treatment places where people can go, lack of the providers, because one of the reasons for these disparities, we don't have enough mental health providers as well, doctors, psychiatrists. It's not necessarily the branch of medicine where a lot of people actually try to go into. Um, so church can step in and fill this gap, fill this void, help these people, maybe not necessarily help medically, right, but help providing sense of community belonging, spotting their signs of mental health issues, trying to connect them to treatment, or even providing treatments, you know, through compassion, through empathy, through listening, through help. Um, so yeah, so talking about suicide, I wanted to transition from this to suicide. I wanted to talk first about prevalence. As I mentioned, we experience an increase in suicides in the United States. This statistics is from 2017, so a couple years dated, but nothing really changed in these years. If it changed, actually worsened, not improved. But in 2017, it was 10th leading cause of death after cancer and heart disease. You know, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death for all the population. About 47,000 people yearly take their lives. Um, when we talk a lot about homicides, especially now we talk a lot about, you know, crimes and homicides, but there are actually twice as many suicides in the United States than homicides. Um, on average, one person commits suicides every 11 minutes in the United States, and we have the high suicide rates among wealthiest nations in, you know, compared to any other wealthy nation. So this is the statistic I mentioned. That number of suicides per 100,000 people, you know, when we look at the population, we look at number of suicide per the population, um, our numbers are growing versus other countries are decreasing. And it's actually interesting and kind of sad that normally life expectancy, basically how much a person who is born this year is expected to live, every year life expectancy in the United States was in everywhere else is growing. So by a little bit, by a couple of months, but like now I think it's life expectancy is 79 years. So and we, life expectancy usually is something that grows with every year. Last 2 years was the first time since 1919 where life expectancy is actually decreasing by a little bit by 1 or 2 months, but it's not increasing, it's decreasing. And one of the reasons it's decreasing is because of suicides, but not only suicides, it's what researchers actually call a death of despair. So it's suicide, alcoholic liver disease, and opioid or drug overdose overuse. So um, that also highlights the role of the church to step in because suicide and all other issues, what researchers calls death of despair, right? It's opportunity for the church to provide hope, to provide connection, to provide meaning in life, and to prevent this from happening because this is becoming a public health issue. And for example, even talking about not only about suicide, but talking about death of despair, um, drug use and opioid overdose is one of the biggest issues contributing to decrease in life expectancy. And sometimes for researchers, it's difficult to disentangle suicide versus overdose. Was it intentional overdose or was it just something that happened? And when we talk about addiction, there was very interesting experiment done with rats. One of the classic experiments with rats, rats have this water with heroin. They basically become addicted. Like they in labyrinth and they can run to the food. There is like a place for them with food and something nice, but there is also a place in the labyrinth with heroin, and they rats become addicted in that labyrinth, and they stop running to food and they just run to heroin and basically die drinking heroin spiked water. But one researcher actually stepped in and said, this research is very biased because rats usually in that labyrinth by themselves on their own as one rat, right? What happens if there will be other rats and there will be like a social connection? So say there is, instead of food, there is like a place where they can socialize, when they can create, like basically a red park, happiness red park. So they modified this experiment, and even though there was a water with heroin, rats didn't become addicted. They preferred a red park, the preferred place where they can socialize, they can have a connections. So it shows that addiction, and by extension a lot of other mental health issues, are caused by lack of connections, by loneliness, by isolation, by social isolation, and that's again the place for the church to step in, um, because in the case of addiction, just in case of suicide, just in case of other issues, alcohol use, or any other issues, a lot of people do that and they become addicted because they're isolated, they're lonely, they don't have communities, they don't have connections, they don't have social support. And if they do have that, that's one of the strongest ways to stop them or prevent addiction, prevent suicide, prevent mental health issues. And that's where church potentially has a lot of opportunities to step in. Um, so that's the reason I mentioned death of despair. So if we look at who commits suicide the most, we look at young people, especially college students, one of the riskiest group for suicide. So if we say that it's a 10th leading cause of death for all population, for teenagers and students, it's the second leading cause of death. And about 10% of all younger people at some point had suicidal thoughts. And so we look at the teenagers as like, or students, or like younger adults, as one of the groups at higher risk. And the other group of the high risk is seniors. There were, even though they make 12% of population, people 65 and older, they account for 18% of all suicides, and usually their attempts are more lethal. So normally there is one suicide death for 25 attempts. So there are many more attempts. People just not necessarily always successful. But when it comes to seniors, there's unfortunately way more successful. When they attempt, they actually do die. Uh, and so teenagers and seniors, usually two groups at high risk. If we look at the differences between males and females, um, even though women attempt suicide more often, uh, men die more often from suicide. So basically, men 3.45 times more likely to have a fatal outcome from suicide. So if we look at all suicides, white males account for 7 out of 10 suicide in the United States. So it's, even though women attempt it more often, men actually die more often from suicide. And talking about groups, so white males, if you look through ethnic data, or if you look among different subgroups within the United States, um, white males are the highest group of risk, followed by Native Americans and Alaska Natives. So there's two ethnic groups that are at high risk of suicide. I mentioned in the beginning that's the work I'm doing. Teenagers, especially those who LGBT teenagers or transgender, they at very high risk of suicide, 5 times higher than any other groups. And especially for transgender people, they have 40% of all transgender people attempted suicide at some point in their lives. So if general rate for population is 4% for all population. So among all population, 4% of people try or attempt suicide, even less. It's 10 to 12 times higher for transgender. Um, and one of the issues with suicide when we talk about access to lethal means, more than half of all suicides are connected to firearms. So access to firearms, it's one of the risk factors. So if firearms are accessible, it's a risk factor for suicide because more than half of all suicides are accomplished by firearms. So that's the statistics. So basically, I just the statistics was there to tell you who is more at risk, what groups are more at risks. There are some myths or misconceptions among people about suicide. Um, so one of the misconceptions, so if somebody is suicidal, once they will always be suicidal. Even working with my app, one of the reasons we created the app is to highlight the issue that people, researchers know, that suicide is very situation specific and time specific. It's risk factors are short-term risk factors. It's very something that may happen within that same day, within that same specific situation. So the idea that people suicidal for a long time, so it's not necessarily true. Sometimes they just it becomes heightened within a specific, say, day or week. It can be very short term, very situation specific. It's not necessarily something that goes on forever. And while suicidal thoughts may return, there are a lot of people who attempted suicide. If you remember, I mentioned that for one suicide death, there are 25 attempts. So there are a lot of people who actually survive suicide. And they go on to live their lives, normal, perfect lives. So I think the statistics is about 250,000 people each year become suicide survivors in the United States. So there are a lot of people who actually attempted. They don't ever go back. They get help and they become, they live long and happy lives. So it's not something that people fixate on, and it goes on forever. Uh, One other misconception or myth is that talking about suicide is a bad idea, and if I talk to somebody about suicide, I will encourage them to do that. Um, there is a lot of stigma associated with mental health and with suicide, and unfortunately, people who actually need help, they don't even get to talk to somebody about it, that about their thoughts or about their struggles. And they a lot of suicide happens because people don't have ability to connect with somebody and share their issues, share their struggles. Remember when I told that, isolation is one of the reasons for mental health or suicide or addiction. So talking about suicide actually is not necessarily bad, and sometimes it gives opportunity for people who may think about it to talk about it and to voice their concerns. And it actually gives people ability to rethink their ideas, rethink their options, and it can be uh, therapeutic. It can be preventable, something that prevents suicide rather than encourages it. The other thing I wanted to highlight that not everybody who has mental illness becomes suicidal. So I think if we look at the statistics, about 50% of people who are suicidal have mental health issues. Some people don't struggle with mental health issues, but they go through difficult periods in their lives and they become suicidal. So not all suicide is related to mental health issues. So that's not necessarily true. So all people who commit suicide are mental health patients. Um, One of the other misconceptions or myth is that suicide happens suddenly without any warning. It's something that just happens. It's not true. People actually, those who become suicidals, they try their best to show some warning signs, verbal, behavioral warning signs. So sometimes it just becomes overlooked by us, but they try to signal their behavior. So it's yeah, while some of the suicides are actually very like in the moment decisions, usually there are some warning signs leading to suicide. So it's important to recognize those warning signs. Um, One other myth or misconception is that somebody who is suicidal, they're determined to die. Um, so they basically, if they decided to die, they're just going to go through it and they try. It's not necessarily true. They very ambivalent, and suicide is actually basically reaction to the emotional or psychological pain that becomes intolerable. So so it's not necessarily that they want to die. It's just basically that emotional pain becomes so difficult that they decide that the best way out of that emotional or psychological pain is to end their life. But if there is other way to help them alleviate that emotional pain, suicide becomes unnecessary, right? Um, the other misconception, people who talk about suicide, if somebody talks about suicide, that they means that they don't necessarily want to do it. Um, it's not true. People actually, when they talk, they often mean to do that. And the reason they talk about it is just basically that's their way to reach out and ask for help or support. Um, Usually, people who attempt suicide, they experience anxiety, depression, hopelessness, that emotional or psychological pain, and they feel that there is no other option, and so they reach out to other people and they basically trying to get help, by talking about suicide. um, there is also other misconception, that people who have their life together, who like very successful, or you know or they have appearance that everything is going so well for them, right, that they never become suicidal. That's not true. There are many examples. We can talk about Robin Williams, right, who's a comic actor, had a great life, right, seems to be, but committed suicide. Or Anthony Bourdain, who had his job was just basically travel around the world and have amazing food, right? So great life, but yeah, that not necessarily means that obviously that they're not at risk for suicide. So that's not necessarily true. So that's that's just some of the misconceptions. I can stop here because I'm talking already a lot. Maybe there's some questions or comments or anything that you want to ask before we move forward. Yeah. Oh, okay, let's. Sorry, I'm giving you a lot of information. So some of the risk factors, right? So we talked about myths and misconceptions about suicide. What are some of the risk factors? So mental illness or mental health issues, that's one of the risk factors, specifically mood disorders. So depression, bipolar, anxiety disorders, that's all one of, a potential risk factor for suicide. If somebody has a substance abuse issues, that's another issue, potential risk factor. Somebody who lives with chronic illness or with intolerable pain, um, long-term pain, cancer patients, or that's one of the reasons why we also talk about seniors contemplating or having suicide, because it's sometimes the result of chronic illness. If somebody had a traumatic brain injury, that's something that considered a risk for suicide. Um, Prolonged stress in somebody's life, like especially people if they subjects of harassment, bullying, relationship problems, or unemployment, basically anything that leads to social disconnection. Remember, again, I'm going back to that example of rats in the rat park versus rats in the labyrinth with cocaine water, right? Anything that breaks those connections between people and prevents forming the connections, people becoming unemployed, having relationship problems, becoming victims of bullying or harassment, or people who just don't fit within a specific group, they often become victims of suicide. And that's again place where can church step in and help them form these connections, maybe especially looking for people who may not have otherwise any means to connect to other people, people who uh, ostracized, misunderstood by other people, people who may not fit well with some other groups. If church can be welcoming, accepting place for them, it's not only saves their lives for the future and for heavens, but actually can save their present life right now here on earth as well. It can be literally life-saving experience. Um, Also, sudden stressful events in life, like rejection, divorce, financial crisis. That's the reason why we're also concerned now with COVID and everything that follows COVID. The potential for suicide spikes is very real, because people are going through a lot of stress, very sudden, unexpected, unanticipated stress, and very serious stress. People with history of childhood trauma or abuse, people who have access to firearms, and if there is a history, of family history of suicide, or somebody witnessed suicide, or being exposed to somebody's suicide, it's heightens somebody's risk. So that's the risk factors. Um, so that's basically just saying that if anybody within that kind of group, if you know somebody who may fit one of those risk factors, it's better to be more careful and attentive to them. Aside from the risk factors, there can be warning signs, right? That's people can be in a risk group, but not necessarily be suicidal. Obviously, not everybody who has life stresses becomes suicidal, right? Um, they just become at risk, but not necessarily that anything will happen to them. But there's some warning signs. That's something that tells us that potentially people contemplating or considering it. And it's important to be attuned or notice this warning signs, and kind of be mindful in trying to step in. So there are warning signs, what people talk about, what kind of moods or their emotional health that you can notice, and what their behavior tells you. So uh, one of the most obvious ones, it's when people talk about it, right? So if people talk about killing themselves or feeling trapped, or they talk about unbearable pain, if they say that they feel like they're burden to others, if they say that they have no reason to live, or they talk about being hopeless and empty, if you hear somebody talk about this, that's potential warning sign that you need to be careful about and um, react to it. So that's if you in a conversation with somebody and the person talks about one of those things, either mention killing themselves or just saying that they feel trapped, that there is hopeless, their life is empty, there is no reason to live, they feel like they're burden to others. um, People who at risk of suicide also showing this emotional warning signs. um, and this is basically just if you notice that something is out of normal pattern. So people can be anxious as a there's some people who are more anxious than others, right? But if something is out of normal pattern, if you notice that changes, like that's something that just doesn't fit normal picture for this person. So for example, if they become suddenly have no interest in any activities or anything that's going on around them, they become catatonic, like loss of interest, or they become suddenly very irritable, um, or anxious, or you notice signs of depression, or they become very agitated and angry. Again, something that just doesn't fit normal pattern for this person. Um, or sometimes people before suicide, they just become very relieved. They just kind of like let go. And, if you notice that somebody, for example, was uh, full of emotions and then suddenly they just become zen, and uh, relief, that can be also warning sign. So that's signs of mood. And there is some of behavioral signs. For example, obviously, if somebody starts using drugs or alcohol suddenly very at increased rate, if they're searching online, that's often the case with teens, especially if you look at their search history and they notice that they search online on the internet how to end their lives. Um, if they started to become withdrawn for any activities, isolated from people, if their sleeping patterns change, they sleep either too much or too little, if they started to say goodbye to people they love, and or start to give away their stuff that they value, like, oh, take this, like, here's my most valued thing, take it, uh, if they become suddenly like showing very reckless behavior, if they die, change, and they gain suddenly a lot of rapid weight gain, um, all these signs can be potential signs of suicidality. That's behavioral signs. Uh, so say that you notice somebody displaying some of the signs and you're really concerned, right? Um, what are some of the things you probably shouldn't tell? Let's start with that first. Um, Things that are not helpful. And unfortunately, we say this because the reason why we often say this because we're anxious about this person, and our anxiety doesn't really help us to come up with something that is actually helpful, right? Sometimes when we're anxious, we're trying to calm ourselves by talking to others, right? Necessarily because we're worried about them. And so instead of trying to be helpful for them, we worried and concerned about them, and we trying to calm ourselves by saying stuff that may not be helpful to the person who actually experiencing suicidal thoughts, right? So telling them, just be positive or stay positive, or don't say that, don't talk about suicide, it's not really helpful. It invalidates their feelings, and saying that what they're thinking about it's not valid, or just basically negate what they say, like, oh, no, that uh, remember when we talked about suicide, I mentioned that talking about it actually helps people to reconsider their options, and and just basically, if they dealing with a lot of pain, just letting it out, it actually helps. Sometimes, when I worked in counseling, I thought about people who are anxious, almost like having air balloon in their minds, and they're not going to be able to hear to what you try to say to them unless they let the air out. unless they try to talk about it, and and it kind of, that balloon shrinks in their mind, and then they open to hear what actually you have to say to them. So helping them to actually talk and express their feelings, their anger, their sadness, anxiety, it actually really helps. And by telling them, just stay positive, or don't talk about, we stopping them from having this conversation. We kind of negating their feelings. uh, One of the other things that may not be helpful, saying, "Oh, I know how you feel," or um, I would be so devastated when you go." Remember, that's not about you again; it's about them. So, so you know, shifting conversation towards you, it may not necessarily be helpful. You have to stay with them. What's going on with them in that time? You know, um, and it's impossible to know what they feel. Everybody feels in different ways. So telling them, "I know how you feel," it's everybody's situation is very different and very specific. uh, Saying that, "Oh, you have so much to live for," or focus on positive things in your life, even though it's well-meaning, it's not necessarily helpful, because if somebody is depressed, they're not in the mindset to count their blessings. Remember, again, I mentioned that balloon in their mind. They don't see anything else. They see only that problem, only that issue. They somehow, become so focused and entrapped in that problem and that specific issue and the specific pain they experience in the moment. So telling them, "Oh, there's so many other things," or like, "count your blessings," um, it's not what they actually able to do at the moment. But what actually helps, when they actually may be able to do that, when they talk about it, when they let it out, when they feel heard, listened to. So that's really helpful. Telling somebody that, "Oh, suicide is for cowards," or "it's very cowardly thing to do." We don't want to shame people who go through mental health issues, and that inspires shame. Um, and actually, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because naturally we're afraid of death, and so suicide is not necessarily a very cowardly thing, unfortunately. So again, saying something that, "Oh, you don't mean that, you don't want really to die," it's again invalidating person's feelings or what they plan to do. So it may not be helpful. Um, Telling them, I heard a lot, well-meaning people say this, in the hospital, "Other people have it worse," or "you being selfish." It's not helpful. It's usually not, people not in the contest who has it worse, right? Or who has the right to be depressed. It's not like we lead in a contest. And what helps the most for people is to stay within their reality with them, to hear what they're going through, not comparing it to others, not shifting their attention, but to be with them, to hear what's the issue, what's the reason of their pain, what pains them, to be in that moment present, in that situation with them, rather than trying to divert attention to tell that somebody has it worse. It's not necessarily helpful, and also inspires guilt, making them feel worse, right? Telling them that they gonna go to hell, or if you don't believe in hell, that it's a mortal sin, or again, shaming or guilting people may not be helpful. Telling them that they looking for attention. "Oh, you're doing this because you're seeking attention." uh, yes, they're actually seeking attention, but they're seeking attention because they want help. Remember that one of the reasons they actually may look for attention is not because they're self-centered, but because they really want somebody to stop them from what they're trying to do. And so if they're seeking attention, that's actually a good thing. They're trying to get help, and so be with them and help them right in that moment. Um, I heard like some of the people say like that sometimes, stop playing the victim. Um, these people can be victims of mental illness, right? And we don't really tell people who have cancer, stop playing the victim, right? Um, and so by extension, we probably shouldn't tell this for people who suffer from mental illness as well. just like cancer is very real and pain from cancer or pain from any other health issue is real, mental health issues, mental health pain, and emotional suffering is just as real, right? And so they can be victim of cancer or they can be victim of mental health issues. It's just as bad, right? And so they're not necessarily playing the victim. Um, I heard people saying that, well, can't you see how much you mean to everybody? Everyone loves you. It's another way to sell that's to tell them that suicide is selfish. Even though it's good to remind them that everybody loves you, but what helps the most is to show that you love them right in that moment, that you're ready to listen, that you're ready to be with them in that moment. Um, Another thing that probably shouldn't tell, it's suicide is the permanent solution to a temporary problem. Um, Unfortunately, some people who are trapped in that mental health issues and pain and suffering, sometimes they do seek permanent solution. So saying them, it's kind of basically validating what they looking for, right? So it's not necessarily helpful. Trying to tell them to do something to take their mind of a thing is not helpful because mental health, mental pain and suffering, it consumes your mind. It's if you could do something to take your mind off it, you would definitely do that, and there'll be no suicides. But unfortunately, it consumes all your mind, and it's not easy to just kind of switch into different mode. Um, if that would be possible, again, we'll probably not have issues with suicides. Telling them to stay strong, it's basically saying them that, well, you're a big person. um, and so it's not helpful because, again, there's a limit to which people can endure some stuff, and and some people just cannot tolerate things anymore, right? So it's telling them that they're weak. It's basically, again, shaming them. um, Telling them that things can be worse. Well, yeah, you have it bad, but it can be worse. Well, yes, but it doesn't really help the person in that moment, right? um, so that's, that's some of the things, that you probably shouldn't tell them, right? um, so okay, so if that's all the things you shouldn't tell them, so what then you should do, right? If you see somebody who's struggling, um, I would encourage many times. I would encourage that by doing little, but showing person that you will be willing to stay with them in that moment, that you're willing to listen, that you're willing to be present. You're not gonna judge them. You're not gonna try to fix them. You're not gonna try to fix the situation, but just that you're empathetic, that you really feel sorry, and that you really want to know what they're going through. That's potentially one of the most helpful things you can do. Um, and being honest and having open conversation really helps. And so here's the example what you can do. So if you notice somebody having showing this kind of signs of suicidality, you can name the issue first and can say, you've been canceling all our plans, or you've been like acting in this way, or I see this and this and this going on. um, you know Basically show, like, naming those warning signs why you worried. And before you go into next point, you can say, I'm seeing all this and I care about you. Remind them that you're not going to judge them, or you're not saying this because you try them to fix them, but say, I care for you. uh, and next thing you can do, you can normalize these signs as a signs of suicide. Basically say, I know that people who behave this way sometimes may think that uh, they want to end their life. Um, and then ask directly, I want to know this because I care for you and I want to help. Are you thinking about suicide? So asking this, it's really opening up the place for a person to talk about it, right? So the best way to do this, is say, like, I've seen these signs. I do care about you a lot. I know these signs can be signs of suicide. Are you considering suicide? Are you thinking about ending your life? um, because again, we try to avoid this topic, and what we can do is to first talk to people about it and then try to help them, right? So, so if somebody says yes, if they consider suicide, um, you need to ask about their plan. By basically plan, do they have a specific plan in place? Is this plan lethal, right? So for example, if how serious, can they actually kill themselves? Do they have access to means to do this plan? And are they planning it now or in the immediate future? So basically figure out how dangerous is the thing that they're planning to do, if they're actually planning to do that. So if somebody say like, well, I thought about it, but maybe sometimes in the future, that's one thing. If somebody says I'm suicidal in this moment and I considering, doing something to myself, your strategy can be very different, right? If you know about immediate um, plans and the immediate serious thing. If you know, regardless of the situation, you try to so you try to de-escalate the situation. So you can try first, de-escalate people, because sometimes they consider, like most of the times, they consider suicide because they're in a very critical state of their minds, like dealing with a lot of emotional and psychological pain. So helping to de-escalate is basically first of all validating their feelings, telling that their feelings make sense. It's okay to feel they do. Don't tell them, oh no, no, stop feeling. Saying, yeah, it makes sense. It's horrible. Yeah, I feel you. It's makes sense that you're feeling this way. It's instead of encouraging the suicidality, it actually encourages connection, communication, and basically shows people that you hear them, that you don't dismiss them, that you don't dismiss the seriousness of their feelings, but you understand and you say like, well, yeah, this is bad. I know, I feel, yeah, it sounds pretty bad. Um, Ask open-ended questions, help them to talk to you, right? Just show that you're willing to listen, help them to have a conversation with you. And it helps, by asking open-ended questions. So tell me more about it. Or, so just open-ended questions can actually show that you're willing to listen more. And sometimes just paraphrase, tell them what they tell you back. Like, well, so you're saying that, you know, and it also shows that you're listening and that you're willing to listen, right? And sometimes it's really helpful by just having a conversation, having these people to open up to you. And sometimes it's all it takes for them to de-escalate. uh, so depends on severity. Remember I asked you, I told you to ask them about the plan. If obviously if the plan is immediate and you see that you're not able to de-escalate the situation, don't hesitate to call 911. It's definitely, and don't leave the person who is acutely suicidal by themselves. So if you know that the plan is immediate and they're pretty serious about it, then call 911 and stay with them up until 911 comes. If you see that plan is not immediate or you were able to de-escalate the situation, here are some other helpful steps that you can do. Uh, Help them to reduce this isolation. So, as I mentioned before, a lot of people who are depressed or are suicidal, they feel very alone, right? It's an issue of loneliness and they feel isolated. So if somehow you can help them to be among people, it really helps. Also, supervision helps a lot. So most of the times, suicide's a very solitary act. It doesn't really help when somebody is present in the moment. Um, so it's good to, somebody is potentially suicidal, to make sure that either parent or friend or family member is there most of the time throughout the day up until issue de-escalates. So somebody who can supervise these people. um, Also a good idea to have a contract with person, make a verbal agreement or a contract saying that if you see that they de-escalated and they right now they're okay, um, made them promise or ask them to make you promise that they either call you or somebody like, you know, uh, counselor or specific person, not just somebody, but very specific person. It can be you, it can be friend, it can be parent, it can be anybody that's very specific, right? Not just call someone, right? Call this person, right? And usually two or three people is better than one, right? So you're gonna call your mother, you're gonna call, I don't know, counselor, you're gonna call somebody if you feel that that the feelings come back and they escalate, right? And make sure that they can get help. So regardless of de-escalation, try to see if they can connect with a mental health professional. So sooner or later, preferably sooner, connecting them to a mental health professional can be a very, very good thing as well. Because even though we can help by listening and help to de-escalate a situation, um, we're still not equipped to act as a mental health professionals. So in many, many cases, it's a help immediately, but then it's always good to connect somebody to a counselor or somebody who's trained to follow up on your progress. Um, yeah, so I guess that's in a nutshell all my presentation. Now, again, sorry, I can talk about it for a long time and give you a lot of information, but I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. This is very helpful. And maybe I could ask one question. So, as a Christian or yeah, or Adventist Christian, um, we talk a little bit in our Sabbath school already, but sometimes we'll bring up like, oh, if we have faith, we won't feel that weak, or we will be strong. Is suicide ideation has anything to do with lack of faith?
No, not unfortunately not. It's not a lack of faith. Again, I know maybe it's may sound an unpopular opinion. Just like cancer has nothing to do with faith, right? As much faith as you can have, you can still have cancer, right? Unfortunately, and I can give you the whole sermon, right, about the reasons why people have cancer that have nothing to do with lack of faith, and we can look at the words of Jesus who said that it's not because of the specific sins or anything like that, but it's because we live in a world that has sin issues, diseases, right? And same with mental health issue. I know somehow we look at it differently, but just like cancer, mental health issue has very specific mechanism through which it works and can be relieved through medication. So it's not necessarily moodiness or weakness. It's it's a disease that people can get just as well that they can get COVID or they can get cancer. And just like for COVID or cancer, there's some ways we can help, including medication, right? Same with mental health issue. There's some ways we can do to help, including medication as well. So I would encourage to look at it just no different as you look at cancer, COVID, or I don't know, name it any other disease. It's an illness, um, an illness that has a lot of stigma, unfortunately, and that's part of the stigma that sometimes we just feel that, oh, if we can be just strong and snap out of it, right? And uh, forgetting that you cannot snap out of cancer, right? You cannot snap out of mental health issue, and you need help sometimes. That's real tangible help.
Thank you. And I noticed too sometimes with physical illness that like for example, high blood pressure or cancer, we don't necessarily attach shame to it, but somehow with mental illness, we attach shame to it, like, oh, it's a shame to have that. I don't know where it come from. I don't know if you have any idea, but a lot of times, I think that created part of the stigma too, that shame is attached to mental illness.
But the problem also with shame or stigma, it's not necessarily, but like also that what society or church or community attaches stigma to it. But a lot of times people who have mental illness, they have internalized shame. They feel like they cannot talk to somebody. And the reason why they have so many suicides is just exactly this reason, because they're so ashamed of what they're going through that they're not willing to talk to people about it. And as the result, it becomes unbearable and they end their lives. So there is shame coming from the outside, but also shame that lives inside me that prevents me from talking to people and asking for help. And the suicide's often a result of it, result of that shame and stigma, because it prevents from connections, from conversations, and from help, from seeking help, right? So when we talk, in public health, we talk about stigma can be deadly. And that's exactly the example of how stigma can be deadly, right? Because it prevents people from seeking for help, looking for help, asking for help, connecting to people and saying like, hey, I'm struggling. I'm really, really struggling right now.
Okay.
Because it feels like, well, I'm showing weakness or I'm showing lack of faith. Not necessarily. And, we can look at I come from Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia historically and still struggle with alcoholism a lot. And I can see how attitudes change and stigma changed a little bit before. When we thought that alcoholism, or abuse of alcohol is just lack of will or anything. But now, what we know that it can be actually disease that people can get out of it, and it can be actually they can be genetically predisposed to it. It changes, right? And it changes stigma attached to it. People more willing to ask for help. We are more willing to help them. We don't really judge them. We're like, oh no, I understand. You're probably struggling when you need help. Sometimes you need help, medical help. Sometimes you just need help, to stay away from it. And that's why we have, these groups, Alcoholic Anonymous, 12 steps, right? Because we understand that people sometimes that's actually a disease, and sometimes people just can be predisposed because their parents can be, abused alcohol, before. It can be on genetic level, right? Exactly same can happen with mental illness. Sometimes it has nothing to do with weakness of character or weakness of faith. People can be predisposed genetically. It's an illness just like any other illness, and seeking help is a good sign and shouldn't be discouraged by attaching stigma to it.
Thank you. And there's one question came to me. On this last slide, is it better to talk to the person one-on-one or with 2 or 3 friends?
It's better to be one-on-one with the person, because it takes a lot of courage and trust for somebody to open up to you, and they may not have the same trust or courage to somebody else. And so you can sometimes see that people start to close back, when they feel that somebody else that they're not ready to talk to, they don't feel that kind of connection or comfort or level or trust, to trust them, because it's very, very deeply personal, right? It takes a lot of courage for me to say or admit, hey, I'm really struggling, right? And this is serious. It's even saying this, it takes a lot of courage and trust. And I mean, if you know for fact that they're very comfortable with those other 2 or 3 people, you can bring them. But oftentimes it's more a one-on-one conversation. And again, and remember that your role in the conversation is not to fix anything, because sometimes you just can't fix, like you're not gonna able to make the situation somehow magically better. But what you can make better is just to be there, sit there, listen, to not judge, not fix, not jump, not offer solutions. Just listen. That sometimes it's the most therapeutic thing, when people actually know that you're willing to listen, that you're not gonna shut them down, that you're not gonna invalidate their feelings, that you're not gonna offer immediately solutions, but you just be willing to like, tell me everything. I'm here for you. I'm ready to listen, and I'll try to understand, and I'll be open.
So in a sense, it doesn't take a professional to actually support a person that are considering ending their life. It could be a regular person with a open heart and some listening ears and willing to journey with them along the way.
It sounds very easy. Well, of course everybody can listen, right? But honestly, it's not easy to listen because our natural instinct, if somebody cries, we offer them a tissue right away, like wipe it up, if somebody tells something bad, we try to fix it for them. Like, oh, this is bad. Like, have you thought about this? This is can fix it. I found the solution. But, so it's our natural response to somebody's suffering, and it's difficult to keep it down and just don't offer solutions, don't offer like tissues or like stopping them, but just and try to understand. It sounds simple and easy, but it's not easy in reality.
Yeah. Thank you. And then I think our church is trying to also do a presentation on how to care for people in appropriate ways. So that will be coming too. Just making an announcement and the advertisement here.
That's
And
great.
yeah, another question: how do you deal with a let's see, sorry. How do you deal with a person who is suicidal but is trained in spotting suicidal tendencies?
Oh, somebody who actually is suicidal but
Trained,
also knows a lot
trained.
about.
To spot the tendencies.
So somebody who's suicidal but they also trains, so to spot. Um, well, I think that even for more openness, like it's like, well, yeah, if that would be me, I can tell like, well, I know that that's these are the signs. I noticed them with you, and and again, I think it's all about trust, and um, if anything, there's people who are trained, it takes even more for them to admit. You know, I, I know about myself when I worked in counseling before. We're willing to help other people, but we're not willing to accept help. Um, so, if anything, it's it's a little bit more difficult to get them out of them. Help them open up, and because first of all, because they're so trained to fix or help other people, and second that they also try to suppress whatever going on with them. But again, I think genuine openness and willingness to be there, and you can be even more open with them and name the things that you see, like, I see this and this and this. I'm being honest with you, I'm concerned. So honesty is a very very good policy, and honesty mixed with care, to remind them, you saying this because you actually do care, and you're concerned, and you want to help, you want to be there. But I think if anything, it's good to be reminded that, first of all, that's a serious issue. Suicide is, it happens quite often. Anybody can be suicidal, like we cannot dismiss anyone. Anyone can struggle with some difficult issues. Noticing the signs is really good. And if you notice the signs, remember again, have an open conversation, assess how serious they are about it, and if they like acutely suicidal and they plan to do something, call 911 and sit with them. If there is no concrete plan at the moment, and talk to them and listen and do what I mentioned, make sure that they're supervised, make sure that they get care, that they connected socially to somebody is there for them. Just don't leave them alone. Oh, I think you muted.
Good afternoon.
Oh, you mind if we stop the share screen so we can see people on the panel
Yeah.
view again, so we can end. This is great. This is very helpful. I think our church community is a very loving and caring community. It's just now we have some tools that we can be more aware and know, a little bit more what is helpful, what is not helpful, and this conversation, I hope we will continue to continue so that we can be a stronger community for God and for each other. Yeah, thank you, Alex.
Welcome.
Oops. Okay, so can we stop the screen
I think
share?
sorry. Yeah, I think, sorry.
Okay, there we go. And so we can see everybody.
I thought I did this.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I hope that this is helpful to us. And if you know where your um, hand clapping sign is, just press that so that we can get that hand clap to Dr. Dubov. Thank you for your time, and we've learned so much.
Thank you. Really
Yeah,
appreciate the opportunity to meet you all and hope there will be other opportunities sometimes.
thank you. Would you like to end? Would you like us to end with a prayer? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Dear God, thank you for giving us some quiet time to focus and to know how to care for each other in a better way. And you know our hearts. We are a community full of loving and caring people. May you continue to expand our hearts so that we can just be even more loving. First, to be kind to ourselves, and then to our loved ones, and to the community that we care for, and then extend to people who we even have a problem with, or that we normally do not engage with, or people that we consider enemies. Continue to be with us, build us, continue to help us to be strong only in you, because with just ourselves, we are weak, and we know that when we are weak, you will be stronger in us as well. Thank you for the grace and love you continue to give us. May we have a good the rest of Sabbath afternoon and see each other again soon. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Yeah.
All right. This ends our live seminar. Thank you again for joining. Have a good afternoon.